Hello, everyone. I am with Kelly Carlin-McCall, and Kelly is a writer, teacher, broadcaster, and transformational coach. She has a master's in Jungian Archetypal Psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. So welcome, Kelly.
So nice to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Kelly, there's a couple of things, we were speaking just before we started recording, but I had in mind a couple of things is, of course, and you've written the Carlin Home Manual, and there's life with George. What is it like being the daughter of someone like George Carlin and living with George? And then for the second part, I was hoping that we could get on more, from when you went to Pacifica, undertook your master's degree, and what you've been thinking and doing since then.
Yeah, that pretty much sums up almost the two halves of my life, kind of the two adult halves at least. Yeah.
Life with George. You know what I was thinking when we had a chat? Is, when James Hillman talks about the Daimon, that kind of unique guiding spirit, and you were living in the same house with someone with a very big Daimon. Um, that kind of was what struck me. Um, so
Yeah,
tell us about that.
it's funny, when I read Hillman's The Soul's Code, because I'm always looking for my own soul code. He used a lot of examples of celebrities to unpack and kind of to illustrate this concept of the daemon and how it works through the life, and certainly being someone who closely observed a person who was definitely abducted by an energy that moved his life in a very singular direction. It was really it was very helpful, and I've been always jealous about my dad in that way because he just was one of those people that was on a mission and had a mission, and nothing was going to get in the way of it. Uh, and I've been such a floater my whole life, more like a butterfly. My path is very flittable. So yeah,
Butterfly is the soul, by the way. The
yes. And
So
it's one of
that's
the
all good.
symbols at Pacifica. So yeah, absolutely. And the whole cocoon, the whole caterpillar cocoon butterfly journey, certainly any of us who do any kind of self transformational work or work with others for that, the messy betwixt and between is a space that we're all pretty familiar with. But yeah, I mean, I always saw my dad, the energy around my dad was this work that took him away from me. He was gone when I was young. It was the 60s, and my dad was a famous straight comic, as they used to say. He had a short hair and no beard, no mustache, and worked in all of the very normal dinner clubs of America. Uh,
What is a straight comic though? Excuse me.
well, he was not counterculture yet. So in that parlance, meaning that he was traditional.
Right.
He wasn't, I mean, there were only traditional comics back then in the 60s. There were a lot of musicians who weren't. There were
Mm.
already a lot of musicians that were counterculture, but comedy, basically, you had to, in order to be famous and to make enough money, you had to be able to go on TV. And comedians that went on TV until the early 70s were very much had a suit on and clean cut. And so that's who my dad was. And when he was that comic, he was gone a lot. He was gone a lot most of my life, but really as a kid, I remember looking at calendars of his because he saved everything, and I inherited all the archives. And just I think there was a couple of years in my early life when he was gone, probably almost two-thirds of the year on the road. So that was interesting. There was always a longing for him, a longing to be near him and with him and to be seen by him and heard by him. And it was always magical when he was home because he was a kid, basically. So my poor mother had to play the parent role no matter what, which always pissed her off more than anything else. That was part of her.
So your mother had quite a few kids, basically, and
yes, exactly. And then my mother too was wanted to be a free soul. So, but she had to be the mom and the dad. So there was that part of it. And then the interesting thing that comes with the difference between when you start to figure out that your parent is a celebrity, like known by people, and then there's this divide between private life and public life that happens. And my dad was pretty much consistently the same person everywhere, but private life is private life. And as people know, have read my memoir, or if you do read my memoir, you will find out that until I was the age of 12, there was a lot of drugs and alcohol in my house. So there was a lot of chaos in my house because of that. And then, of course, when my dad did become a counterculture, grew his hair out in 1969, 1970, grew his beard, and then these three big albums, FMAM, Class Clown, and Occupation Fool, came out within 2.5, 3 years of each other, all went gold, platinum, the whole thing. He rocketed to a whole different level of status. And of course, now he was outwardly counterculture, which means that he was part of the drug culture. It was more apparent and okay. But still, there was a dividing line for me as a kid, especially about what happened at home with the chaos around that versus me going to school and pretending that everything was okay. And so when that started to happen, I think that was an interesting time in my life because there was this real performativeness part of my personality then where I had to look okay and everything had to be great out in the outside world. And I really kind of split off from myself in some ways. And really that became my main way of being in the world. And that shaped me my whole life. I'm still dealing with that kind of stuff. But my dad and my dad in general as a dad was a really warm, interested dad when he was home, and taught me how to ride a bike, and made sure that I listened to certain comedy albums and knew who certain people were, and made sure I woke up for the landing on the moon, like made sure I saw, like he loved these moments in life, in our cultural life, when a cultural collective moment would happen. And he would really make this moment of it, like, hey, this is really happening, or this is important for you to understand. And like we went to Kent State a year or two after the shooting, and he like wanted me to understand and saw the memorial, and I was a kid and it was scary. It was confusing and scary. So yeah, but there was always this thing. And then as a teenager, the thing happens where you're a teenage girl and your dad kind of starts to disappear because he doesn't know how to have conversations with you about anything. He's afraid sex will come up in some way, probably. And so he and we still connected, but now we always connected through humor and things like that. I mean, like our family, we really connected through humor. We always watched humorous things together and TV shows, and like that was a big bonding thing for our household to watch comedy on TV. But in high school, then I started encountering and really getting much more exposure to other people who knew who my dad was. I'd have guys in math class who would come up to me and do my dad's routines for me, and I think. And and
That's
looking
like you
back
was
on
in
it,
maths class. I had to give it maths class 100% focus. I couldn't have handled any distractions like that.
yeah, well, we went to a crazy small school, and we were all like in the AP math stuff. We were all like smart kids or whatever. But yeah, it would be weird. And it would be like, and I would think like, like a part of me was thinking like, what's the point of this? Like, are they trying to impress me? Or, and if you're trying to impress me in a sexual way, I don't think doing a dad routine is going to do that. So that was always funny. Um,
Having seen kind of fame close up, what would you say about it? And I ask you that because I was speaking to Mark Matusak yesterday, well, a couple of days ago, and he kind of started it with Andy Warhol at the factory and the Interview magazine, and he had to go and interview the rich and the famous, and probably that was a bit of an eye opener for him. But what would you say about worldly fame now that you've seen it close up?
oh, well, I mean, it's been a real ride for me because even after my dad died, I mean, especially after my dad died, I suddenly became his voice and face and representative in public. And I didn't grow up around, I mean, I grew up around the fame I grew up around was fans' reactions to my dad. We didn't hang out with famous people in my house. My dad was an introvert, more like a writer personality. And then in high school, junior high and high school, I went to school with lots and lots of kids of famous people. So it was kind of normalized in that way, but still, I mean, you go over to Ryan O'Neal and Farrah Fawcett's house, it's kind of interesting. You're like, oh, look at those pictures of Farrah. You get it. I mean, I was at a friend's house in high school who, um, her stepfather was Mike Medavoy, who ran UA United Artists, and he would have screenings all the time. And we went over there one night, and Mikhail Baryshnikov was there, and we were all 16-year-old girls and took a jacuzzi with the guy. So there was like that kind of like, huh, oh, kind of thing. Um, and then at the same time, you're kind of an insider, so there's kind of like a yeah, all right. But then when my dad died, I started meeting a lot of famous people and hanging out with famous comedians and all sorts of things. And my dad always got a rush too. I really take my dad's modeling with this too, because even though he was a famous guy, he got a kick out of it too, for sure. Like he felt the shine and the magic of Hollywood. He's, forever a little kid watching Danny Kaye on the big screen. Um, so when my dad died, I was suddenly surrounded by these people and just kind of in this kind of surreal thing all the time. Like it's so surreal. It's like, oh, I'm on a dance floor with Alec Baldwin right now. Like
Yeah.
you just have these moments, and a part of you is like giddy, and the other part's just going, yes, the weirdest thing ever. Just the weirdest
Mm.
thing ever. Um, and coming through it now and then being on a stage myself and having a little bit of fame, and people recognize me every once in a while for different kinds of things. Um, and then also having the experience of my dad's fans meeting me. And the weirdest experience one can have is when you see the moment that you are no longer human to them and you are a mere object. And I think that is where I really started understanding the psychology of fame, that this
Yeah,
is
right.
a huge objectification of human beings into this numinous object for people's psyches. And so to be on the receiving end of that, where someone's just wanting to talk about my dad,
Yeah.
or just wanting to talk about how I'm connected to him, or something about that, or even talk about my own influence on them, like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm meeting Kelly Carlin, thing kind of thing. You are immediately disappeared. You disappear. Your humanity is no longer here. So you're just dealing with a person who's just having this psychological projection conversation with you,
Yeah.
basically.
It's like
And it's
Marilyn Monroe becomes Venus, and
yes,
Marilyn gets lost in the Venus because it becomes an archetypal thing.
uh, exactly, absolutely. And you wonder why people drink and do drugs in this
Yeah.
industry, because it is difficult enough as an artist to always be on the edge, the creative edge, and opening up your vulnerability, and then to be completely disappeared, your humanity disappeared, and there's no one around you who's willing to ground you and keep you grounded and see you for who you are. It's an extremely weird and lonely experience. Um, yeah.
Kelly, can I ask, because I know you're interested in Zen Buddhism, so how did that start? What age for you? Like, was that,
Well,
am I right in assuming that there's always been a seeker in there too with you, and
oh
that,
God, my whole
you know,
family, all three of us, major
mm,
seekers. My
mm,
mother, especially, major
mm.
seeker. When I was in high school, my parents were doing creative conflict and all this kind of like, 80s,
Sounds
you know.
exciting. Creative.
Yeah, my dad dropped a ton of acid in 1969. That's why he grew his beard out and everything. It's why he rejected this traditional uptight straight persona that he was supposed to be. So total seekers, always seekers. And so we were totally in the new age movement in my household.
I just want to say one thing. I read the book "Circling the Drain," which is about which obviously about. You wrote the forward, but it's
Right.
Hillman, George Carlin, and putting them side by side, which is kind of neat.
I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I got from that is, like in the beginning, I was thinking Hillman, George Carlin, and then as you read it, you go, seeing through, that ability to see through things, to the behind. The love of language, Hillman, a great lover of language, and the ability, I would call it that kind of mercurial Hermes uh, quickness of wit with language, which I could see the similarities, and especially as you see it together. It's a good book.
Yeah. As I wrote in the forward, I had felt the attunement between them for sure. Um, and that looking under, always looking under
Yeah,
for the
behind,
other
under.
meaning,
Yeah,
under and behind.
yeah.
And I think I really, really inherited that from my dad. And I think that has always been part of my seeking is there's got to be meaning underneath this. There's got to be some other structure to look at all of this with because
Mm,
this doesn't seem like it doesn't feel like it just is. And
mm.
and my dad was like that always in like little subtle ways too, where he would get really excited about synchronicities. We loved the number three in my family. So like, if we got to a hotel and they gave us room 333, it would be like, oh my God, we're just in such heaven right now. And he was always picking up coins places and had meanings for the dimes and the quarters and all sorts of things. And so yeah, the seeking was very easy for me, but it was really interesting too because it was definitely new agey in the 80s. It was all that Edgar Casey and kind of all the mystical and Shirley MacLaine, huge like oh my God, just ate up the Shirley MacLaine stuff. And then
Dr. Wayne Dyer or Dwyer
oh
or whatever.
yes, yes, on PBS, Dr. Wayne Dyer, yes, absolutely. And the Zen Buddhists always fascinated me, but also kind of always intimidated me because there was this invitation into really stripping it all away. Chop wood, carry water. There's not a lot of mysticism in that. There's something else in that, and I didn't quite know what that was, and so I was fascinated by the Zen stuff. And then really what happened, what sparked it for me was I had a I had a cassette tape, oh, a good old cassette tape back in the days of a gentleman named Thich Nhat Hanh and his meditations, and it was the flower fresh, water calm, mountain solid. And I was having a ton of anxiety. I was going through a lot of anxiety in my life. I was in my first marriage and I was having panic attacks and stuff. And it was like the only thing that I found between his voice and the imagery that really calmed me down. And then my mother died when I was 34, almost 35. And I, had like Shambhala Sun magazine or something. And I opened it up and there was an ad in the back, and Thich Nhat Hanh was coming to Santa Barbara for 5 days. And I had never, ever done anything. I'd never told anyone, like I'd never gone on a spiritual thing. I did not have a spiritual practice of any kind. I dabbled a lot and read a lot and fantasized. And it was the kind of thing, when your mom dies when you're 34, 35, you're like, oh, death, here it is. And
Yeah.
and I did have a real awakening the week that she died. I mean, a profound, profound awakening of an intense amount of unconditional love entering my heart and holding space for me and others. Um, so I signed up for this thing and I went. Hadn't driven a car further than 10 miles from my house, and I had to drive to Santa Barbara, which was a good 2 hours away, and
Gee, that really was a pilgrimage.
it was a
That's like
huge
going
pilgrimage.
out the back of Nepal.
Yes, I mean huge. And I like when I arrived, I thought, well, if it's just this, I've done everything for this. Like, I guess I'll go check it out also. And then I had to like share a room with someone else, and I had to eat my meals in silence. I mean, it was a lot of, and I was I'm a very controlling, spoiled only child. Like, people don't require things like this of me. I resist. And I'm a rebel's daughter. So suddenly they were stripping all of my personality away and asking you to do certain things. And the first 24 hours was torture. But then the second or third day, well, the second day, the morning of, I went on a walking meditation with Ty, and there was about 200 of us on the beach. And that was the first awakening that happened for me, where we were walking on a trail together, and I looked over and there was a fox about 40 feet away hunting and had no idea we were there. And I thought, ooh, there's something going on here with this stuff. Um, and then I think it was on the third or fourth day, Ty was giving a Dharma talk, and I had a total and complete transmission. I mean, the amount of energy that entered my body and the amount of expansion that happened for me, uh, I didn't even know what was really going on as it was happening, but I had read later that it was called a transmission, and it can happen around very enlightened beings. And I did. I had this huge expansion of my idea of the self, beyond the ego, and came home and really uh, joined a sangha and ended up studying for 5 years very diligently and taking the precepts, the vows of the precepts and things like that, and going to retreats 2 or 3 times a year with my new teachers, and got a really, really solid foundation in learning to sit and just sit, and have your heart opened.
Kelly, when I first went to India, they had that word drishti, which means what comes through the eyes or something. And I think some people call it darshan. I've heard darshan.
Yes,
But
I think it's a Zen term. Yeah.
uh, these people that, through the silence or the soul, it cuts right through or something. And it's like a wake up call or something.
Yeah, it really does. I think for me, it was one of those moments where, like I said, I'd read a lot of the New Age books, and I'd always been
Mm.
like, well, wonder what that's like, when I really had, between my mother
Experience.
dying and then that experience, like a real sense of something beyond the ego. And then immediately when something like that happens, we begin to chase it. We begin to want it and to chase
Yeah.
it. And of course, you can't get there if you're chasing it, because it's now you're in the seeking, chasing mind. Um, so you have to learn to kind of not chase it and just it's really a removal process in some ways. But that transmission moment, it does make you think, like, we really don't have the instruments to measure whatever that is, whatever that energy, whatever this thing is happening between psyche and psyche. uh, it's as real as the chair you're sitting on. So you're having this experience, profoundly
Yeah.
subjective, and yet it is interpersonal. It is intrasubjective in some ways too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, cutting, jumping forward a little, how did you get to Pacifica? How did that all happen, and
Well,
why?
my former sister-in-law from my first marriage, she had been an early Pacifica person, like back in the day when there was like 20 people in beanbag chairs and they all went to Greece and Hawaii every year. Like it was when Stephen Eisenstadt had just formed this thing. And I think when Hillman was encouraging him to make it into something real and all of that. And so I'd known about it in the 80s because of that. Um, and then what happened was my mother died, and I decided to go into showbiz. And I wanted to be a comedic actor, kind of more of like a kind of a person who kind of talks straight to camera and does funny little bits. The Daily Show was new at the time, and I wanted to kind of be like Beth Littleford and things like that. And then, of course, I'd seen a lot of solo shows, and Spalding Gray. I don't know if people in your country are familiar with him.
No,
A
I'm
brilliant
not.
a brilliant monologist and storyteller. He had a very famous show that you can see the film of called Swimming to Cambodia.
Right.
And he's just a powerful storyteller in the sense that he let all of his neurosis out on stage and really showed you the insanity of his own mind and his own thinking. And I loved that because my dad was such a controlled performer, as opposed to Richard Pryor, who would come on stage and tell you about lighting himself on fire. My dad would never tell you about anything like that. So I think I was really fascinated by the getting to be raw and real on stage. And I'd seen a couple of different solo shows, and I thought, you know what, I want to do that. I
Mm,
want to tell my family story. And so I wrote a solo show called Driven to Distraction,
mm.
which was about the kind of like the five main events in my life that where I let myself be distracted from my true self. And as a kid, you can't help that. You kind of get what your parents give you. But then at some age, you start to make choices for yourself. And so I talked about all of that. And at the same time, I interwove it with these journal entries that I had written during my mother's sudden sickness and death within 5.5 weeks. And so it was really about my spiritual awakening in the end. And I sent the script to my dad and to let him know that he's in it and I'm doing this thing. And it made him very, 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 very uncomfortable. But he said to me, "Look, I love you and you're an artist and you can do this, but I can't be in the audience. I'm still uncomfortable with the chaos from your childhood. I still have a lot of guilt about that. And I don't want to be the dad sitting in the audience." And because he and I were very close and very enmeshed, and he was my only parent, and I loved him dearly, I thought, well, I'm not going to do this now.
Mm.
And so I knew that I needed something though. I needed a mission. I needed a home. I needed a place. And I'd read Maureen Murdoch's Father's Daughters, and it kind of changed it kind of woke me up to what the hell was going on in my psyche about my dad, and
And,
being a father's daughter, 100%.
and what would be the main thing you learned from all of that?
I learned from the book that I lived for his approval, and that it's really hard to get out of his shadow, and that until I claim my own territory and my own inner territory and my own permission, I will always be in his shadow. And I was just kind of waking up to that part of my life. It was still terrifying though to me to even think about, but it really did. It made me think a lot, and
Yeah.
so I I started checking out grad schools, a bunch of different ones, and all the ones where they were so academic. And I really did want a spiritual. I wanted a place where I could explore spirituality or the soul or those kind
Yeah.
of deeper those conversations. I didn't want
Yeah.
it just to
You
be
didn't want
intellectual.
straight, dry
I didn't.
intelligentsia
I didn't
or
want to.
intellect.
I didn't. Yeah. I wanted to. I wanted a master's. I wanted something that would test my intelligence and my intellectual side. but
Yeah.
I needed a home. I needed a
Yeah.
home. And so I went up to Pacifica to the orientation day, and they always have a faculty member at the orientation, and I walk in and it's Maureen Murdoch, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to Pacifica. And and I loved it. For me, it was a place where I could, because you could write and you could do art for different things. I sent them the script of my solo show as my writing sample. I mean, I got in like that. And
Yeah.
most classes, the first year I was in the counseling psychology thing, and they want you to kind of work through your own material. The first year, all we did was write about ourselves. So I was just writing myself now through all the theory, learning through developmental, through Jungian, through all of it, through the myths. Um, and got to work with Maureen on the heroine's journey, encountered that. And it really, for those 2 years that I was actively at Pacifica and on campus and doing that, were almost now to this day still the best 2 years of my life. I mean, it was like being in Hogwarts school. I mean,
You know
you
what I was
know,
thinking when you were speaking is, for me, I think, one of the things I always love about Jung is that he gave a language. And, when we were talking about that seeing through, seeing behind, but then there's this archetypal background or something, a kind of and a language for it that is a deepening, just the
yeah.
very fact of learning that gives some depth or breadth to the whole thing.
Well, absolutely. The language finally. I mean, and I'd already been a fan of Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. So I might already been activated in that way. And it so resonated with me. And then, finding out that Joseph Campbell's archives were on the campus there, it was like, and so it was like, oh, I am going to finally go to the place where I can lift the curtain and see behind it. And I did. And even though I spent 2 years there and then my internship and got my master's and all of that, I only scratched the surface because I really didn't know a lot about Carl Jung or archetypes or things like that. I mean, it was still all very new to me, and I was still trying to figure out the difference between my idea of it when you read it and the actual living into it.
Yeah.
And I really feel like the last 6, 7 years of my life have I been really finally living into it. And
Going
even
into your
finally,
bones, maybe. It's kind of like, to me, it's a kind of this deepening process like takes time. There's the idea or the thought or the language, but to 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 bring it down into your bones is kind of a thing that takes time.
yeah, and and so like being trained as a therapist, so you start to see it in others, and you start to see, you start to see it all kind of playing out, all the complexes and everything, and then it takes a little bit more bravery and courage to run into your own complexes. And of course, I was in Jungian analysis the whole time and
Oh
spent,
yeah.
and with the we were required to be that way, so I could have both intellectual and real therapeutic conversations with my analyst, and he could help me kind of put those pieces together too through my own experiences. So that started happening, and then but and then I decided not to be a therapist. I knew I wasn't interested in being a therapist. I just wanted to get my master's at Pacifica, but and focus on the
What do you
Jungian.
think that is? You just never had that calling, or
Oh God,
you've
I've been
got
a
other
therapist since I
callings,
was
or
I've been a therapist since I was 4 years old with my parents.
ah,
It's part of my core wound. So it was just way too triggering for me. The first time I was an intern and I went on vacation and one of my clients started decompensating and having self-harm thoughts, I was like, where are the adults in the room? Because I can't handle this.
mm,
I knew, I mean, the people who can handle that stuff, the therapists who can do that, oh, thank God they're in the world. And so I ended up going into coaching because I wanted to
yeah,
have powerful, transformative conversations, but
conversations, yeah,
I wanted to only work with high functioning people. I could not. The first time I was in a room with a borderline person, I mean, I almost lost my mind. It was like, I am
Mm,
way too porous for this kind of work.
mm,
Um, and ultimately, I'm an artist. Like that really is my first archetypal urge in the world is to express myself. I do love teaching this stuff. I do love holding space for other people. That is part of my passion, but um, I feel like I've been put on earth to really express myself.
mm.
So I knew that I couldn't be I couldn't go for the level of expression I wanted to do out in the world
Yeah.
and be a really excellent therapist who I think they need to be somewhat invisible.
And careful and cautious and, uh, you know,
Yeah, because
even,
they're holding all the projections on people and willingly stepping into that relationship of the complexes and the projection of the complexes in order to help someone work it out.
mm,
Whereas, as a coach, you kind of co-design the conversation, and you get to name it in a very different way,
mm,
and it's a very different part of the psyche you're working with, and that's why I always
yeah,
I always have conversations with people before they become my clients because I need to find out, are they
yeah, looking for a therapist.
right, and are they just going to project George Carlin onto me the whole time? Because it's not going to be, they're going to waste their time and money if that's what they're doing, because I'm not up for that. So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, and then, moving, and then when my dad died, like there was a whole nother, like all the themes we've talked about here, the fame, the the be my artist self woke back up because there was suddenly room on the planet in a way that only people who've had a parent die understand. That moment where you realize, oh, I
It's kind
don't
of like
have
you
to.
have to step up in a way, don't you? It's kind of some archetypal thing of the aeons that, as someone passes away, another person has to come up.
Yeah, and you're no longer obligated to take care of that psyche anymore in that interdynamic thing you have with a parent, which is there's always some sort of contract that's been written between you.
Yeah.
And so now that they're physically no longer here, the contract can break. And of course, then you watch how the contract keeps going anyway, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
I need I need to work on this a little bit. Like this contract's over. They're gone.
Yeah.
So, but that's when you really do start to see the complexes in such a different way. But when my dad died, it was, my mom died, it was like that. Yes, of course. There was a new freedom for me, but when my dad died, it was really, really profound for me. Um, and at the very same time, I felt an incredible honor to be the keeper of his flame alive.
Mm.
Um, I'm, his work in the world was incredible
Yeah.
and changed a lot of people's lives. I mean, the year he died, 2008, was when we got Facebook and Twitter. And so social media became a thing, and I started encountering all of his fans on there. And
There's a cult of George Carlin that are strong.
there is. And at the beginning, it was, it was a little overwhelming, but I thought someone needs to receive this love from these people for a while. And so I just became just kind of the vessel that just did that. I didn't take it on. It wasn't mine. But I knew someone had to have a face to say, I just want to let you know that your dad really changed my life, or he really did this, or my mom and I talked about religion because of your dad.
Yeah.
Like they'd had these experiences. And then, of course, just so proud of, I mean, always I've been proud of him my entire life and his incredible
And, and Kelly,
genius.
with you, out of the pantheon of Greek goddesses and gods, which ones do you kind of relate to?
Well, certainly when I learned about Persephone and the mother-daughter relationship in that way, Maureen really turned me on to that, Maureen Murdoch. But I have to say that Athena really is my gal. You know, I think certain of us daughters feel like we were born out of the minds of our fathers.
But
And
then again, in the Odyssey, Odysseus was guided by Athena. It's the other way around.
well,
And
yes, she has a very important role to play in that.
mm,
Yes,
the
absolutely.
Metis, or how do you say that word? Metis or Metis, Metis, but that kind of intelligence, which, and that's interesting in itself because we often see intelligence in that kind of left brain, Apollonic kind of way, but that, what is it? It's that kind of divine intelligence a little bit, isn't it, or something?
Yeah. It's grounded in also in holding all of the pieces at the same time,
Right.
not just the intelligence used to understand or separate or define or power over, but it's almost it's like a combination of intellectual intelligence and that um
Whole, it's
yeah,
kind
the
of
emo
Iain McGilchrist, left brain, right brain,
yeah,
union or something.
yeah, and kind of more of like an emotional intelligence because they understand how
Wisdom.
everything, the intelligence of understanding the network and the connection of
Yeah.
it all, the
Yeah,
big
that's
picture.
good.
And yeah, yeah.
And I'm
Uh,
going to give you, I know this is, I'm probably, maybe I'm taking an excursion and going off track, but I need to give you a quick Jungian test. Um,
oh boy.
is that okay?
Oh, I can't wait to hear this.
You
Yes,
have to
let's
give
go.
permission. Individuation, what is it? This is in 2 lines or so.
My understanding is it is the ability to be guided by the self with the capital S and not by the cultural norms that we are all conditioned by.
Very good answer. I'm giving you a 7.5 for that. No, hang on, 8. That's very good. The shadow.
That is the part of ourselves that the cultural facing, performative, obligated ego does not like, and therefore has no knowledge that it even exists.
Sometimes. But there's
Yeah,
gold in there too, sometimes. There's a lot
that's
of
where all the
gold.
gold is. Of
Yeah.
course.
And
Yes.
especially for a artist slash performer, that there's a lot of gold in the shadow.
I mean, that's all Hillman is let's go hang out in the shadows together. Like, dream in the underworld. Hello.
And just lastly, anima and animals. What's anima?
It's so interesting. I remember when I was first at Pacifica and reading all that stuff and would read Jung
Yeah.
and my eyes would spin and like would be like, oh, I don't know what that is. Uh, and more I've come to understand it. And I mean, obviously the most basic part of it is that men have an anima and the women have an animus, and that's because we are female, feminine, masculine, and that other part of us, the contra gender, or whatever the hell you want to call it,
Contrasexual.
contrasexual part of us, uh, will be the opposite of what we're kind of biologically and culturally who we are. And therefore it's a part of our shadow. It's part of the shadow of the and if we don't or if we're not in healthy relationship with it, it will affect our relationships with everything, but especially with that sex. So if a man is anima bound, usually means he's got a mother complex and that his relationship with women are probably not healthy.
Well, he can be very nice to them. It's just that they end up going off with the biker. But he was very nice to them and polite and burnt some incense and did all of that kind of stuff. But
Exactly. Yeah.
something else,
Right. But
yeah.
right, but doesn't have the that the woman
The
is actually wanting to be attracted to. Yeah, absolutely.
and the
Yeah.
animus. I think,
well,
the other interesting thing, I don't know, I read this somewhere, so it's not the exact words, but in the middle of life, or, as you get older, that there's kind of this crossover too, because maybe men have to awaken some of the anima, the feminine side of themselves for deepening intimacy, whatever, and women taking more of their place in the world, awakening some of that animus. So sometimes it gets a bit confusing about who's got the animus and who's got the anima happening.
Yeah, and I think, the difficult part of it too was even that Jung really only wrote about the anima because he was a man and that was his relationship with that. And he was investigating that. And of course, we know everything he wrote about was through his own personal unpacking and, of course, working with clients. But he ultimately was a man. He was not a woman. Um, and I do think that I think you have to have a healthy relationship with both your inner mother and your inner father, or your inner masculine and your inner feminine, no matter what gender you are,
Yeah.
because society conditions you through its lens of what the feminine and the masculine are. And so no matter what you've kind of ingested, it's got some, it's a little convoluted, or it's a little broken, or it's a little,
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
conditional.
Yeah.
It's not the unconditional feminine. It is not the unconditional
Yeah.
masculine. It is not the great mother. It is not the great father. So I think, investigating all the different faces of the inner masculine and the inner feminine are necessary for every person, because these two energies, the yin and the yang energies, which it's so much easier to hold it in that way, are what makes the world go round. The
Mm.
tension between those is
Mm.
what made the universe. It's what is the energy of creation.
Yeah.
So, I don't consider myself a Jungian. I mean, I really, really am much more interested in the imaginal, archetypal, post-Jungian, the stuff that happened the last 50, 60 years of how
Yeah.
we've kind of talked about this, because I feel that, you know, Carl Jung was a man of his time. And he had a very particular awakening and experience, which is profound. And, when I went to Switzerland this summer and sat at the tower and sat in the spot that he would sit every day and
Yeah.
carve these figures into the side of the wall there. And, and the impetus for him to build that tower, like that's what
Yeah.
I take from Carl Jung is the Red Book, is the courage to take his psyche seriously.
Yeah.
And that's what I feel like that's the mission now that I really feel on, is like teaching people to be in relationship with these inner realms, this, deep imagination, the imaginal, whether it's waking dreams, sleeping dreams, doesn't matter. But Hillman's way of encountering figures and letting these figures be autonomous and intelligent.
Mm.
Um, this is the way forward for
Mm.
humanity right now. I really, really believe that. And you mentioned Iain McGilchrist earlier. I think he's got a very different language around this, but
Yeah.
this is what he's talking about.
Yeah.
He's just coming at it from his brain science direction. But I really feel like this is our only chance as humanity, is to start having more of a relationship with this part of our psyche.
I think I get from Hillman is that, the soul loves depth. It's like we need depth.
Yes.
And that,
Yeah.
okay, I might have grown up in a society where there was they put up certain markers, of what it was all about or whatever. But at the end of the day, my soul wants depth and is fulfilled by richness and depth and all of that. And it's kind of like what I get from Iain McGilchrist is, oh, I thought I was a bit weird with some of those right brain tendencies. I've been trying to hide them. Like when I went to university, I was like, hang on, this essay's got a beginning, a middle, and end. I can draw on some footnotes, but it's kind of like, oh, well, the right brain has actually got its own intelligence. It's got its own pattern making, whole making,
Yeah.
We've crucified the right brain a little bit, although paradoxically, we love to see it in performers and artists and comedians.
Right.
You know,
Yes, exactly.
that's where we get the
Exactly.
fix.
Well, yeah, because they're willing to follow a call of some kind. And, the way I've been taught to work with dream or imagery or metaphor through my dream tending work with Stephen Eisenstadt is you follow the call.
Mm,
And not as an artist so much, but as a soul artist, like you follow the image. You're not the leader in an active imagination. The image is, the figure is.
mm.
And the intelligence then reveals itself. And I've been working with a series of dreams the last 2 years where it just keeps, it's like a present. I've got like 3 or 4 dreams, but they just keep unpacking.
Your dreams, you mean? Me?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they just keep unpacking in a way where another layer, again, you and I talked about where's the meaning, like lifting the curtain, that's what soul is looking for is where's the meaning? Where are you willing to go to find it?
Mm,
And for you and for me and for each of us, it's it's a path, but it is only our path. No one else is on our
yeah.
path.
It can
Uh,
never be the same as someone else's. And I don't know. I think it's kind of what is it? Some sickness we have of looking around at other people sometimes when we can only follow that meaning, that
yeah.
calling.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I think for human evolution and for social evolution, cultural collective evolution, you know, we needed some sort of way in which to meet each other in that way and comply and cooperate and things like that. But there was always a guy or a woman in the community who was the one who knew how to travel, and I mean,
The shaman.
yeah. And so I think really what's happening is we are all being called now to learn our shamanic ways, so that we can, I think it is an evolution of humanity. It's an evolution of consciousness, this awakening. And more people, I mean, God, you look at the last 60 years in the West, or even before then, I
Incredible.
mean, that was what was so interesting about going to Aranos, when we did the Jungian thing was, it's the 1930s and
Yeah,
people
there
are like,
was. Yeah.
yes, they have nudist colony up the hill and they got the Eastern symbols are coming in the comparative religion. Like it had already started, and this conversation of like, oh yeah, I mean, Jung's dream of shitting on the church. I mean, it's like that's the collective unconscious right there. Like it's over. The institutionalized kind of collective meaning making is gone. And now
Yeah.
humans are off to another layer of it.
Mm,
And we're just still in the baby steps of it. It's only been 100 years that we've been kind of have permission to even be able to do this.
yeah.
Uh, so
It's
it's an exciting
exciting.
time. It is.
It's
It's an exciting
exciting.
time. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I ask everyone this, and I know we're kind of, maybe we're getting close to, but in this present time, this crazy, polarized, uh, intense, upside down, Alice in Wonderland time that we live in,
Yeah.
how did, I mean, you're working with people, right? You're taking these workshops, you're doing your coaching, etc. What are you finding, and what do you think about how to navigate through strange times?
Yeah. One of the other,
I just want to say one thing, Kelly. Sorry, just before you
yeah.
start, is that I think everything you just said before this kind of is true to this as well. Like how we're going back to that old deepening, etc., etc. But anyway, go on.
There's another arm of something that I study, which is integral philosophy.
Yeah.
Ken Wilber, don't know if any of your audience or you are familiar with him. He didn't start it, but he built on a lot of other people who've studied this kind of understanding of the integral perspective. And much of what I see culturally and on the surface, and certainly in politics, is really, really explained very well by him and Steve. There's a guy named Steve McIntosh, who I'm actually going to have on my own podcast. I'm recording with him next week. He wrote an incredible book called Developmental Politics, which really talks about this. And so there, there are these cultural worldviews that are in clash, and there's traditional, modern, and postmodern that are really in clash with each other. And there's kind of within the modern, there's kind of the more conservative bent of that, and then there's the kind of the more libertarian bent of that. But there's kind of almost four kind of factions, and that's really what's going on. It's just a giant culture war between all of these, because the postmoderns think that the moderns have ruined the planet and they don't want to hear anything about it. And of course, the traditionalists think the postmodern people are out of control and are going to make everyone trans or something, like some sort of weird thing. And the modernists are
They
like,
could
well,
just look at you and make you trans. Because that's
exactly.
how
Like, you're
far
gonna,
out they are.
I mean, you're going to school, then your kid's coming back, and then it's like, it's craziness, it's crazy talk. And then there's the people in, there's the Age of Enlightenment modernists who were like, hey, there's this thing called science, like science is important. But then they've also deadened and flattened the sacred, right? So that, so they've got, and none of them think that anyone else has anything good about them. They can't see that traditionalism has important values, modernism has important values, and postmodernism has important values, but they can't see each other. But there are people that they call integral who can see all three and say, yeah, I get everybody both has some great things, and they each have some real pathologies too.
Yeah.
And they're all blaming each other for everything. And so I really look at kind of the cultural surface noise, really about that. Like that's
Does it help you
90% of the noise.
when you think about the time, or when
Oh yeah.
does it help you think?
Helps
Yeah.
me completely understand why we're in a post-truth world. There's no more truth. Why basically our government has been in gridlock since the 80s, since the early 90s, since Newt Gingrich came along and basically decided to make politicize conservatism in a way that, and decided not to work with anybody. Like there was no more humanity in it. And so it just really helps me make a lot of sense of it. So I don't feel crazy because of it. It's like, oh, that makes sense now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And what I like about it is, what I might see is that people very much identify with the tribe, and maybe they're not even interested in the conversation anymore because it's just like full on tribalism. So
Yeah, it
if you're
is.
not part of my tribe, forget it. You're wiped off
Yeah.
the Christmas list, and maybe some other things as well. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like that gives some way of holding, giving
Well,
legitimacy or something.
100%. And the thing is that everyone has, because of the way media is now and information is, there's no consensus of information. There's just no consensus. Like, I mean, we were all okay with science up until about, I mean, for the most part, the majority of people on the planet, who were like, yeah, I believe, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I believe, and so what's happened with postmodernism is that it's like they just want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, it's like, well, there's no more sacredness in nature anymore because of the Age of Enlightenment and because of it. It's like, yes, and people are living until they're 100 years old now, and there's medicine and there's all sorts of things. And like, yes, there needs to be balance, but you can't demonize the entire thing called, uh, you know, Age of Enlightenment modernist thinking, because of that one thing. And not everyone in that is on board for that. A lot of people care about the environment and the planet. Um, so it is this kind of real throwing the baby out with the bathwater for everybody. Like you said, the tribalism is like they're not even willing to see the good side of anything. And then people get into defense mode. And once you're in defense mode, I mean, we know as individuals, if you're in a marriage or a relationship, once you're defended, this ain't going
It's
anywhere.
the
It's over.
Great Wall of China.
Yes. If you're not willing to see the person sitting across the table from you as a human who's having a broken heart, or, and being able to step into someone else's shoes, then,
Yeah.
and so, we're in the middle of all of this. And yet,
but there is a good thing. There's a very positive thing in all this, because whilst, we might see legacy media, we don't know who to trust on that side or that side. The revolution is being podcast, as my friend Michael Van Adams said, or something that people are holding conversations in a funny kind of way. I mean, I know I'm trying to be...
no, there's a lot of people who are willing to have cross-tribal conversation. The problem is that the culture, the mainstream culture, we don't have a consensus culture that's willing to do that right now.
Right.
So therefore, you can stay siloed all day long and never listen to a podcast where people are crossing the tribes and wanting to understand each other and come to not come to a middle ground, but to really, I mean, what is the transcendent function, right? It's holding two things and it becomes a third thing.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what needs to happen, is we need to come together to create the next thing. And that's kind of what integral philosophy talks about. It's about including the good stuff, including the foundational things that have been built through many, many hundreds and thousands of years of humanity, and transcending it to a new level where its pathology is not killing people randomly or being racist or ignoring the environmental, consequences of, living in a mechanized world all the time, and the irony is always that, the postmodernists believe that every subjective view gets to has the right to exist, and the right to be seen and heard, and the right to be protected, right? It's very much a caring, everyone has except for the people who disagree with them.
Yeah. And if you take note of recent events, they are actually becoming the people maybe knocking someone off or killing someone. It's come from that side, where it used to be over on the far right, which is a bit mind-blowing.
I mean, talk about shadow. Like you believe everyone has the right to an opinion and a point of view, except for the people you don't agree with.
Except for the toxic white males. They're not allowed to have an opinion either.
Right. And the other thing too is they believe there is no universal truth.
Yeah.
And yet when you say the statement, there is no universal truth, you are stating a universal truth.
I speaking for myself, I think, and it's hard for me to even kind of articulate this, but something about Jung, I've noticed something a conservative side of me, and immediately people would see that in a negative way probably, but I would say conservative in terms of that the new comes out of the very old, the primordial, the archaic or whatever. So I think, one of the problems I have with postmodernism sometimes is that this kind of really, really old, archaic nature is somehow kind of, that's where I see so much new life to come from.
Yeah. I think the real spirit of conservatism is conserving the things that are the foundation of what allowed us to evolve to the next level. Like think of rule of law. I mean, that is a conservative value, is the rule of law and order. Now, it was manifested in a certain way. It was from higher up, from God or from the king, right? That kind of stuff. But there was right and wrong, and it was concretized within a culture, and we all agreed upon it. Now, of course, the rights of man in modernism was like, oh, well, actually, all humans have the right to justice and to equality and to things like that. Wasn't perfect. We didn't do it perfectly. We're still not doing it perfectly, but it did evolve in it. But it's still the rule of law still applies. You know, we're just spreading the who's included in the rule of law, that it's just not from God or the king, that the people are deciding as a collective for things. And so this idea of sourcing from the archaic and the ancient, or even from anything that comes from before, I think there is an honoring of that. There's a, you know, I think of Saturn, the archetype of Saturn, right? It's
Mm.
structure and it's slow changing and it's like
Limitation, constraint,
limitation.
order.
Yes, right. We need some of that, right?
Mm.
So, you know, if you see it through an archetypal lens, it's like you can't just chaos isn't going to work. You can't throw all of modernism and traditionalism out. It's not because
And
you
I
need
think,
the
you know,
foundation of the values of it.
when I look into older, you know, obviously Australia's got its Aboriginal culture, but all Indigenous cultures around the world, um, a person wasn't considered cultured unless they'd been initiated into the first stories and myths, you know. So I would probably, that's where I would see postmodernism sometimes, that I would still see that. Somehow for me, Carl Jung was being initiated into something very old. He was one of the great shamans of the last 200 years or whatever. And there are many other people. You know, Carl Jung's been a big one in my world anyway, in the last
Yeah,
100, 200 years. But there's a lineage, you know, there's a long line in different traditions. And um, that's what it means to be cultured. It's not that everything's a construct,
right, right.
you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. Definitely. Yeah, I mean I think it kind of circles back around to what we were talking about, the importance of the power of acknowledging and being in relationship with the deep imagination, with the imaginal. I mean, that's really what you're talking about is, you know, accessing something that is very, very essential to our humanity and our consciousness because we've been in relationship with that part of psyche way longer than we have with critical thinking
Yeah.
and objectivity and the scientific method and you know all of that kind of stuff like and so there is something it's almost like
A
it feels like
reversion.
yeah, not even reversion but bringing it forward
Yeah.
in relationship. I mean, because we fully reverted, we would give up all the things that got us here. But bringing it in and integrating it again,
Yeah.
letting the mythopoetic
Yeah.
stand
Yeah.
side by side with rationality, critical thinking, hierarchy,
Yeah.
what you know, what all the other things that we've learned along the way to
Yeah.
kind of grow ourselves as humans.
Yeah.
Um, and it is one part that you know, I think with modernism, it really did kind of put the stake in the heart of that
Yeah.
because we lost our relationship even with the
The,
divine.
the soul, the
Yeah.
divine, the
Yeah.
sacred.
Yeah. Yeah. We still had a relationship with it, even though it was through through an institution or through these mediators, but the mystics were around very much so. And there was an experience of something beyond your individual life that was connected to you. And so I
Yeah.
really think we connected in some ways to the collective unconscious in that way.
And then on the other hand, there's this tremendous opening going on. And, you know, you speak to people, and so many people are opening up in new ways and integrating maybe in new ways. Um,
And
there's
I
much
think that
more that comes into the conversation.
yeah, and I think the chaos of these times are going to stretch people and um and we are going to have to either evolve or die. Like, I think that's where we're going as a species, basically. So, you know, but I even think of, you know, being in my country right now, we've got 4 more years a lot of chaos in our lives politically, no matter who you voted for. It's going to be chaotic. And there's going to be a lot of, there's already a lot of disappointers. Half the country is very disappointed and terrified. And the other half are partly excited. And there's probably a good half of those people that are not sure. And they're going to be deeply disappointed because they will actually see that he's not going to do what they want. But we just have to do it differently. I said to people before the election here, I said, no matter what, we're going to have to do this differently because we can't do what we did for 4 years between 2016 and 2020. Personally, my psyche was very activated and my nervous system was really fried. And just collectively, it didn't work. And it's been really interesting to see already people's reaction to it and already some changes going on. So it's kind of exciting.
Maybe that's a good place to finish, Kelly. It's been good fun talking to you. And I was just thinking as you were finishing there that I'm going to start a new Substack, which charges $100 to get into Australia, where if anyone felt like coming, and then it's just a money-making idea I had, which if people are a bit disturbed in the US at the moment, there might be a demand.
Do you have some extra bedrooms, John? Do you have an extra wing on your house? This is what you're telling us?
300 million people. I'm not sure there's room for that, but anyway.
It's only going to be like probably, like more like 30 million of us would end up actually doing it. So it's not that bad.
Anyway, we're not different. We get all our news from the US. Every time I wake up in the morning, I've said this before, I see Donald Trump on my news feed. It's always amazed me. You'd think I'd see Paul Hogan or Crocodile Dundee or something like that, but no, Donald Trump, first person. Anyway, thank you very much.
Oh, John, thank you so much for having me and always a rich conversation. So thank you.